The only thing more ruthless than the North Dakota sun is the men who covet Clara Bennett's land, and the wild, impossible desire that ignites when a stranger strides out of the dust, ready to fight for a widow with nothing left to lose. When bitter drought turns the prairie to ash and neighbors into enemies, Clara discovers that the right ally can change everything, even her heart. If you believe hope can survive anything, don't miss a second of this saga. Stay until the end and witness what it truly means to risk it all for love and for land. If you crave stories where courage outlasts cruelty and loyalty means more than blood, subscribe to this channel. There's more frontier fire ahead. The Dakota Territory in 1882 wore drought like a shroud, the kind of relentless heat that cracked the earth into patterns of despair and turned hope into something too fragile to touch. Clara Bennett stood on her porch at sunrise, watching the wind carve dust devils across what had once been green pasture. At 28, her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had learned that survival demanded everything: pride, comfort, and sometimes even dignity. The black mourning dress she wore had faded to charcoal gray, but she refused to abandon it. 8 months since Daniel's death, and grief still lived in her bones like winter cold that never quite left. The cabin behind her told its own story of struggle: peeling paint that revealed weathered wood beneath, a roof patched so many times it resembled a quilt, windows that rattled with each gust of wind. Inside, 4-year-old Eli slept curled like a question mark, his sandy hair catching the early light. He had his father's coloring, but his mother's gray eyes that held too much knowledge for such a young soul. Since losing Daniel to a logging accident, crushed beneath tons of timber when rope snapped like thread, Clara had aged in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like stone. "Mama?" Eli's voice carried the tremor that had become common since his world turned upside down. She found him standing by the chicken coop, clutching an empty feed bucket, his small face pinched with worry. "The chickens won't come out." "Are they sick?" Clara knelt beside him, smoothing his hair with fingers that still remembered the luxury of softness. "They're just thirsty, sweet boy." The heat makes everything tired. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if animals could sense desperation the way they sensed storms coming. The well had become her daily torment, each trip down to check the water level, each count of seconds before she heard the splash, each bucket that came up lighter than the last. This morning, the rope burned her palms as she lowered the bucket, counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi before the hollow echo reached her ears. Too many seconds. The water table was dropping just as Hank Olson, her nearest neighbor, had warned it would. "Never trust a long summer, Clara," he'd said last winter, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "It'll eat you alive if you're not careful." The 20 head of longhorn cattle that represented her last hope stood listlessly in the meager shade of cottonwood trees, their ribs visible through dusty hides. Each animal was precious, a link in the chain that connected her to solvency, to the bank payment due in 6 weeks, to the possibility of keeping Daniel's legacy alive for their son. 3 calves had already succumbed to the heat and lack of water, their small bodies claimed by the unforgiving land. Each loss carved another piece from her heart, another dollar from her dwindling resources. The approach of riders always brought Clara's pulse quickening, and today was no exception. Gideon Cross from the First National Bank rode at the head of a small procession, his city clothes wilted by prairie heat, his calculating eyes already assessing her property like a vulture circling carrion. Behind him rode 2 men she recognized, Carl Meyer from the general store and Bob Hutchkins, who ran the Lucky Dollar Saloon. Their presence meant gossip had preceded them. "Mrs. Bennett," Cross said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to horses. "We've come to discuss your situation." Clara straightened her spine, feeling every inch of her height. "My situation is my business, Mr. Cross." His smile held no warmth. "When it concerns the bank's investment, it becomes our business too. The payment is due in 6 weeks. With the drought and the circumstances. He let the word hang like smoke, loaded with implication. I'll have your payment, Clara said, though the words tasted like ash. Cross nodded, his expression patronizing. Of course. But we're concerned about your ability to maintain the property. A woman alone with a child. Perhaps it would be better to cut your losses. Mark Davidson has expressed interest in the land. We could arrange a fair price. The mention of Davidson, the territory's most powerful rancher, sent ice through Clara's veins. Everyone knew Davidson's methods for acquiring land, and they rarely involved fair prices. This ranch is my son's inheritance, Clara said, her voice carrying across the yard where Eli played with wooden soldiers his father had carved. I won't sell. Cross shrugged, already turning toward his horse. Your choice, Mrs. Bennett. But remember, pride doesn't pay debts. As the men rode away, Clara felt the weight of their threat settling over her like fog. In town, whispers followed her wherever she went. A widow running a ranch was unusual enough, but one who wore men's trousers for cattle work and refused the protection of remarriage was scandalous. The sunset painted the endless sky in shades of copper and gold when she spotted the lone rider approaching from the east. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped beside the door. Strangers were rarely bearers of good news, especially for a woman alone. The figure resolved itself into a man on a bay gelding, both showing signs of hard travel. Dust coated them like second skin, and the horse favored its left front leg with the careful gait of an animal nursing an injury. The rider stopped at a respectful distance from the house, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and pale blue eyes that held the kind of weariness Clara recognized, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone carrying too many miles and too many memories. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from trail dust. "Name's Luke McAllister. I hate to trouble you, but my horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. If you've got a forge, I can fix it myself. I can pay for the inconvenience." Clara studied him carefully, the worn but well-maintained gun belt, the respectful distance he maintained, the way his hands rested easy on the saddle horn without aggression. Something in his manner eased her immediate suspicion. "There's a forge in the barn," she said finally. "Haven't used it since." She stopped, unwilling to share her grief with a stranger. Luke nodded understanding. "I'm handy with tools. And if you've got any work that needs doing, I'd trade labor for a meal. Been living on jerky and creek water too long." From behind Clara's skirts, Eli peered at the stranger with curious eyes. Luke noticed him and touched his hat brim in gentle acknowledgement. "Fine boy you've got there. Reminds me of my nephew back in Missouri." The mention of family eased another fraction of Clara's wariness. Drifters rarely spoke of kin. "The barn's behind the house," she said. "There's a pump for water. Supper at sunset, if you want it." Luke's smile transformed his weathered features. "Ma'am, after 3 weeks on the trail, home cooking sounds like heaven." As Luke led his horse toward the barn, Clara found herself watching the careful way he moved, alert but not aggressive, like a man who'd learned to read danger in small signs. That evening, she set an extra place at the rough wooden table, telling herself it was simple Christian charity. Luke had not only fixed his horse's shoe, but repaired a broken gate and patched a hole in the chicken coop. When he joined them for supper, he ate quietly, answered Eli's endless questions with patience, and excused himself quickly after, disappearing back to the barn. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind and wondering about the stranger sleeping in her barn. Something about Luke McAllister unsettled her in ways she couldn't name, the quiet competence of his movements, the gentle way he'd spoken to Eli, the shadow of old pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes. She told herself one night's charity was enough, but when morning came and she found him already at work reinforcing the corral fence, she heard herself offering him breakfast. "I could use help for a few days," she found herself saying, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Food and barn space in exchange for labor. Luke studied her face, seeming to measure her sincerity. "I'm not in any hurry to be somewhere else," he said finally. "Long as you understand I work for my keep, not charity." Clara nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of facing the endless chores alone again when he moved on. Days blended into a week, then two. Luke proved himself invaluable, repairing the windmill that had been broken for months, patching the roof, helping Clara move the cattle to better grazing. More than his skill, it was his presence that changed everything. For the first time since Daniel's death, Clara had an adult to share decisions with, someone to watch her back when she rode out to check the herd. Eli bloomed under Luke's attention, following him like a shadow, absorbing lessons in roping and riding and what it meant to be a man. But the frontier would not allow peace for long. 3 weeks into Luke's stay, riders appeared on the horizon. Not the bank this time, but men from town whose visit carried different threats. Bob Hutchkins dismounted heavily, his red face flushed with more than heat. Behind him, Carl Meyer and Reverend Harris wore expressions of righteous disapproval. "Heard you got yourself a hired man, Clara," Bob said, his words slurred slightly with drink. "Folks are talking." Clara felt Luke emerge from the barn behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. "People always talk," she replied. "Never seen it mend a fence or birth a calf." Reverend Harris stepped forward, attempting kindness but achieving only condescension. "Mrs. Bennett, we're concerned for your reputation. A young widow, a strange man living on your property. Surely you see how it looks." The implication hung between them like smoke. Clara's hands clenched into fists. "What I see is that none of you offered help when my roof leaked or my cattle needed tending. Mr. McAllister works for meals and shelter, nothing more." "Now see here," Bob began, but stopped as Luke moved into view, hammer still in hand from his work. Something in the rancher's posture, relaxed but ready, made all 3 visitors shift uneasily. "Gentlemen," Luke said mildly, "unless you're here to help with the barn repairs, I'd best get back to work." The quiet authority in his voice brooked no argument. After tense moments, the men mounted their horses and left, but not before Bob threw a parting shot. "This ain't over, Clara. Decent folks won't stand for this much longer." That evening, as they sat on the porch after Eli had gone to bed, Luke told Clara more of his story. He'd had his own ranch once in Kansas, and a wife named Emily who died of fever while he was away on a cattle drive. Grief and guilt had driven him to sell everything and start drifting, searching for purpose or redemption he wasn't sure existed. 5 years on the road, he said, staring into the gathering darkness. Thought I was looking for something, but maybe I was just running. Clara understood that kind of running, the way loss could make a person want to shed their old skin and disappear into distance. "When Daniel died, I wanted to pack up Eli and go back east to my sister," she admitted. "But this land, it's all my boy has of his father." Luke turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious. "It's good land worth fighting for, and you're stronger than you know, Clara Bennett." The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest, a sensation she'd thought buried with her husband. Trouble arrived 3 days later in the form of Tom Reed and his men. Reed was Mark Davidson's foreman, a hard man with a reputation for getting what his boss wanted through whatever means necessary. He rode up with 5 others, all armed, all wearing the cocky confidence of men who'd never met real resistance. "Well, well," Reed said, dismounting with exaggerated casualness. "The famous widow and her hired gun. Davidson sent me to make another offer." Luke had emerged from the barn at the first sound of hooves, and Clara noticed he'd strapped on his gun belt, something he rarely wore around the ranch. "We're not interested in Mr. Davidson's offers," Clara said, moving to stand beside Luke. Reed's smile held no warmth. "Maybe you should be. Things happen to folks who refuse Davidson's generosity. Accidents, fires, sometimes people just disappear." The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Luke stepped forward slightly, his hand resting near his holster. That sounds like a threat, Reed. You threatening Mrs. Bennet? Reed's expression hardened. Just stating facts. This is hard country. Dangerous for folks who don't have proper protection. One of his men, a lanky cowpoke with mean eyes, laughed. Yeah, real dangerous. Never know when lightning might strike. The confrontation ended when Luke's hand moved to his gun, the motion so smooth and fast it was like watching water flow. I think you've said enough, Luke said quietly. Something in his tone made even Reed take a step back. After they left, Clara found her hands were shaking. They'll be back, she said. Luke nodded grimly. Men like Reed don't give up easy, but they usually think twice when they run into someone who'll fight back. That night, disaster struck. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the panicked whinnying of horses. The barn was ablaze, flames already reaching toward the star-filled sky. Without thinking, she grabbed a blanket and ran toward the inferno, knowing her horses were trapped inside. The heat hit her like a wall, smoke filling her lungs, but she could hear Bess's terrified screams. She fumbled with stall latches, her eyes streaming, driving the animals toward safety even as burning timbers crashed around her. Strong arms grabbed her just as a beam fell where she'd been standing, hauling her bodily from the barn. Luke's face was grim with fear and anger as he dragged her clear of the collapsing structure. Damn fool woman, he said roughly, his hands checking her for injuries. You could have died. Through her tears and coughing, Clara managed. The horses are safe, Luke assured her. All of them. But you. He pulled her against him, and she felt his whole body trembling. They fought the fire with buckets from the well, but the barn was lost. By dawn, only blackened timbers remained, still smoking in the cool morning air. Luke found the evidence they'd both suspected, a charred kerosene can half hidden in the ruins. Reed's work, he said, showing Clara the can. No doubt about it. Clara stared at the destruction, feeling defeat settle over her like ash. With the barn gone and the bank payment due in 10 days, her situation had gone from desperate to impossible. Maybe I should just sell, she whispered, the words torn from her throat. Maybe Gideon Cross was right. Maybe I'm just a fool. Luke caught her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Don't you dare give up. Not after everything you fought for. We'll rebuild. The word "we" hung between them, and Clara realized that somewhere in the past weeks Luke McAllister had stopped being a temporary hired hand and become something much more precious, a partner. The next days passed in a blur of desperate activity. Using salvaged lumber and materials donated by neighbors who'd heard about the fire, they constructed a simple shelter for the horses. Hank Olson arrived with his sons, bringing tools and determination. Mary Patterson came with food and moral support, her presence a reminder that Clara wasn't entirely alone in her struggle. But generosity could only stretch so far. With 5 days until the payment was due, Clara sat at her kitchen table counting coins and bills for the 100th time. She was still $20 short, a sum that might as well have been $20,000. Luke found her there, her head in her hands, defeat written in every line of her body. I could ride to Bismarck, he offered. Find work, earn what you need. Clara looked up at him, seeing the love in his eyes that neither of them had yet dared speak aloud. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my problems. Luke knelt beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his. Clara, nothing I have is mine anymore. Everything I am, everything I own, it's yours if you'll have it. He pulled out his savings, money earned from the cattle drive that had brought him to her door. And I'm praying you'll let me stay, not as hired help, but as your husband, as Eli's father, as your partner in everything. Through her tears, Clara saw not just the money that would save her ranch, but the future she'd never dared imagine. A family rebuilt from ashes, love found in the most unlikely place. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, Luke McAllister. Yes to all of it. When he kissed her, it tasted of hope and dust and promises that would last a lifetime. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge buzzed with tension on payment day. Mark Davidson had arrived with lawyers, determined to contest Clara's ownership if she somehow managed to make the payment. The courtroom filled with townspeople drawn by the spectacle of a widow's final stand. But Clara walked in with Luke beside her and the support of neighbors who'd finally chosen a side. When she placed the money on Gideon Cross's desk, his face went pale with disappointment. Davidson's legal challenge was swift and vicious, claims that the property boundaries were invalid, that federal surveys showed water rights belonged to his ranch, that a woman couldn't legally maintain such a claim. But Hank Olson had kept meticulous records from the original homesteading, and his testimony, combined with that of other old-timers, demolished every fabricated claim. When the judge ruled in Clara's favor, the courthouse erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 blocks away. Spring came to the Dakota Territory like a resurrection. The first green shoots pushed through melting snow. Clear Creek ran full and strong for the first time in 2 years, and Clara's cattle grew sleek on new grass. The wedding took place in the yard beside the rebuilt barn, with Eli as ring-bearer and half the county in attendance. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, while Luke stood handsome in his best suit, his eyes never leaving her face. Reverend Harris, chastened by his role in the previous year's troubles, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Luke's kiss promised a lifetime of partnership, love, and shared struggles overcome together. Eli wrapped his arms around both their legs, claiming his new father with the fierce possessiveness of a child who'd lost too much already. The celebration lasted until dawn, with fiddle music and dancing under the stars. Mark Davidson watched from a distance but didn't approach. His defeat in court had broken his power over the community. Tom Reed had fled the territory after being caught trying to rustle cattle from another ranch. The threats that had shadowed Clara's life were finally laid to rest. As the sun rose on their new life together, Luke pulled Clara close on the porch where she'd first seen him riding out of the dust. "I meant what I said that first night," he murmured against her hair. "I'd still trade 9 herds for one night with you." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "Good thing you've got me for every night now." They stood together watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and promise, their arms around each other and around Eli, who dozed between them. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. The cattle multiplied, the horses grew strong, and Eli learned to rope and ride with his father's patient guidance. Neighbors who'd once whispered now nodded with respect, understanding finally that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. Clara kept the ledger books, Luke managed the herds, and together they built something neither could have achieved alone, a legacy worthy of the sacrifices made to preserve it. On their first anniversary, as they stood watching another spectacular Dakota sunset, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them together. They'd started with loss and loneliness, endured drought and threats and the weight of community judgment. But in choosing to fight together rather than surrender separately, they discovered that the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from refusing to let defeat defeat you. If you found truth and hope in this tale of frontier courage and unexpected love, subscribe to this channel for more stories where hearts run wild and spirits run free across the endless American frontier.